Effective immediately, Olivia Turner is no longer employed here. The words landed before I could process them. I was still holding my tablet. My quarterly performance report was open on the screen. My name was printed across the first slide in bold letters. I had prepared that report for 3 weeks. I had stayed late 4 nights in a row getting the numbers right. Across the room, Daniel Whitaker smiled the way people smile when they are signing a routine document. Easy. Unbothered. Like what he had just said cost him nothing at all. "And I am pleased to introduce your new systems director," he continued, sweeping one hand toward the far side of the room. "Mr. Knox Albright." Applause followed. Shrill applause. My stomach dropped so fast and so hard that I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Knox Albright. The man I had personally trained 18 months ago. The man who had sat beside me for 6 weeks learning how our database permissions were structured. The man who had sent me an email just last Thursday asking how to reset a vendor access token. He would not look at me. Not once. I felt every face in that room turn toward me. Waiting. Some people wait for tears. Some people wait for shouting. Some people simply want to watch what happens when someone's world falls apart in public. I stood up slowly from my chair. "Are you certain?" Yes. Daniel's smile tightened just slightly at the corners. "Quite certain," he said. I nodded once, picked up my tablet, and I walked out. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. Inside that room they believed I had just lost everything. They had absolutely no idea what they had just set in motion. My name is Olivia Turner. I am 41 years old. For 13 years I built the internal database infrastructure of Harrow Logistics from the ground up, starting with nothing but a collection of outdated spreadsheets, a server room that smelled like burnt plastic, and a capital budget that barely covered the hardware I needed. I did not inherit a system that worked. I engineered one. Every permission tree was my design. Every compliance lock was my code. Every access hierarchy, every vendor integration pathway, every automated regulatory reporting sequence was built by my hands and documented in files that carried my name, including one layer that most people at Harrow did not even know existed. The root administrator authentication layer. It sat at the deepest level of the database structure, beneath every other permission tier in the system. It was the layer that validated structural transitions, verified identity during system-level changes, and confirmed authorization during compliance-sensitive operations. When I built it, I registered one identity as the structural root authority. Not because I was possessive. Not because I was trying to protect my position. I registered it that way because I was the only person at Harrow who understood the system deeply enough to hold that role responsibly. I had submitted 3 separate written proposals recommending that we add a second administrator to the root layer for redundancy purposes. All 3 proposals had been acknowledged. None of them had been acted on. Daniel Whitaker had been at Harrow for 6 months when he fired me. He had never once asked about the root layer. Daniel arrived at Harrow Logistics 6 months before he fired me. He came with a firm handshake, a tailored suit, and a reputation built primarily on cutting operational costs at his previous 2 companies. The board had recruited him specifically to modernize what they described as a legacy operational culture. That phrase meant different things to different people. To Daniel, it appeared to mean anything that required patience, depth, or technical understanding. On his first day he shook my hand and said, "I am really excited to modernize things around here." I smiled and told him I was glad to have fresh perspective on the team. I should have listened more carefully to what he actually meant by modernize. Within the first 3 weeks, my name began disappearing from email chains I had been included in for years. Strategic planning meetings shifted to time slots I was not notified about until after they had ended. When I flagged this to the scheduling coordinator, she looked uncomfortable and told me the invitations had gone out through a new distribution list she did not manage. Knox Albright began sitting beside Daniel at every meeting. Not because Knox had demonstrated superior technical skill. His work was adequate at best, and he still relied on me regularly for guidance on tasks that should have been routine for someone at his level. Knox sat beside Daniel because he agreed with everything Daniel said before Daniel finished saying it. In my experience, that quality tends to travel faster than competence in certain organizations. I watched and I waited and I said nothing that was not documented in writing. The first time Daniel undermined me publicly, it happened in the middle of a presentation I had been preparing for 2 months. I was 15 minutes into walking the leadership team through a server architecture proposal that, when implemented, would reduce system downtime by 38% over the following fiscal year. The numbers were solid. The methodology was sound. I had tested the model against 3 years of historical performance data. Daniel raised one hand. "Let's pause here," he said pleasantly. "I think we are getting a little deep in the technical weeds for this group. Let's bring it back to the bigger picture." Several people around the table nodded politely. Someone laughed softly, the way people laugh when they want the person speaking to know they are on the other person's side. I felt heat move up the back of my neck and settle behind my ears. I continued the presentation at the level Daniel requested. A level. Simplified. Stripped of the technical detail that made the proposal meaningful. The proposal was approved in its watered-down form and delivered results 40% below what the full version would have achieved. Nobody connected that outcome to the decision made in that room. Daniel was not threatened by incompetence. He was threatened by expertise he could not control or take credit for. There is a specific kind of leader who mistakes the removal of depth for the achievement of clarity. Daniel was exactly that kind of leader. I documented the meeting in full. I saved my original presentation separately on a personal encrypted drive. I was beginning to understand that documentation was going to matter before this situation resolved itself. Knox Albright began shadowing my work about 10 weeks after Daniel arrived. Daniel framed it casually during a brief hallway conversation. Knox is going to spend some time learning the infrastructure side of things. Just cross-training. Good for the team to have broader coverage. I said that made sense and that I was happy to help Knox develop his technical skills. I believed that for approximately 2 weeks. Then I noticed what Knox was actually doing during our sessions together. He was not asking the kinds of questions someone asks when they are trying to understand how a system works. He was asking the kinds of questions someone asks when they are trying to map what a system does, who controls each piece of it, and what the process looks like from the outside. He took notes on my workflows. He observed how I handled access elevation requests. He watched me navigate the vendor integration panel. He paid close attention during routine compliance export runs. He was not learning to support the infrastructure. He was learning to describe it to someone who needed to believe it could be handed off. I noticed this shift and I made a deliberate decision about how to respond to it. I continued showing Knox the operational surface of the system, the day-to-day functions that any competent systems administrator would need to handle. But I did not walk him through the root layer. Not because I was hiding it. Because nobody asked me to cover it. And Knox never thought to ask about it himself. That gap would become the most significant detail in everything that followed. Before I go further, I want to be honest about what was truly at stake for me in this situation. This was not simply about professional pride. It was not about being right or proving a point to a man who had dismissed me in front of my colleagues. My husband, Warren, passed away 4 years ago from a sudden cardiac event. He was 44 years old. He was healthy by every measure we knew about. He was gone in an afternoon. What he left behind was a mortgage on a house our son had grown up in, a life insurance policy that covered 2 years of expenses if we were careful, and a grief so large I did not know how to be inside it for a very long time. This job rebuilt my stability. Not quickly and not easily, but steadily. Year by year. Raise by raise. My health insurance covered my son's ongoing allergy treatments. My retirement contributions had finally reached a level that made me feel like the future was not entirely uncertain. My son's college savings account had a balance that made me quietly proud every time I looked at it. Daniel Whitaker did not simply remove a title from an organizational chart when he fired me. He threatened the roof over my son's head. He threatened the insurance card in my wallet. He threatened everything I had rebuilt from the hardest years of my life. I want that to be understood. Because everything I did after I walked out of that room, I did with complete clarity about what I was protecting and why. The termination meeting was not on my calendar. That detail matters more than it might seem. A genuine quarterly performance review had been scheduled for that Tuesday morning. I had received the calendar invitation 3 weeks earlier. I had prepared my performance report in good faith. I had gathered supporting data, projected outcomes for the next 2 quarters, and outlined 3 infrastructure improvement initiatives I intended to propose. I walked into that room believing I was there to present my work. The quarterly review format was the disguise. The termination was the actual agenda. Daniel had planned it that way deliberately, and the planning showed in the details. Knox was already seated and introduced before the meeting officially opened. The applause that followed Knox's introduction had the organized quality of something rehearsed or at least anticipated. They had staged it to be public. They had staged it to be witnessed. I believe Daniel calculated that a public termination would be more difficult to challenge and more personally devastating to absorb. He wanted the room full. He wanted the audience present. He wanted me to feel the weight of 30 sets of eyes watching me receive news I had not been prepared for. What he did not calculate was that public actions create public records. Every person in that room was a witness. To the termination. To the applause. To the replacement announcement. And to the fact that at no point during that meeting did anyone discuss my performance. I documented every name I could recall from the room before I reached my car. There is something Daniel never knew about the way Harrow Logistics managed its database infrastructure. 3 years earlier, when the company transitioned from third-party hosted database management to an internal cluster system, I was the engineer responsible for building the migration blueprint. It was the most technically complex project I had undertaken at Harrow. Took 14 months from initial design to full operational deployment. During that process, I worked directly with our primary software vendor to register the proprietary system architecture. Every major component of the internal cluster required a named structural authority in the vendor registry. This was not a formality. It was a compliance requirement tied to our regulatory reporting obligations. When I completed the registration process, one name was entered as the structural root authority for the entire system. Name. Not my job title. Not my department. My personal professional identity, tied to my credentialing information and verified through a multi-step authentication process that the vendor required for all root-level registrations. I had submitted a formal written proposal to senior leadership at the time recommending that a second administrator be added to the root registry as a redundancy measure. I submitted that proposal again 8 months later, and again 14 months after that. The first 2 proposals were acknowledged and filed. The third was never formally responded to. Daniel arrived 4 months after my third proposal went unanswered. He modernized the meeting schedule. He restructured the reporting hierarchy. He introduced Knox Albright as my replacement. He never asked who was registered as the structural root authority. Knox never checked. I want to be very clear about what I did and did not do after I left Harrow Logistics. I did not change a single password. I did not revoke any access credentials. I did not alter any system settings, modify any permission structures, or interfere with any operational process in any way. I took my personal belongings from my desk that afternoon. I returned my building access badge to the security office. I submitted my equipment, including my company laptop and mobile device, to the IT intake desk before I left the building. I drove home. I made dinner for my son. I called my attorney, a woman named Carol Simmons who had helped me navigate Warren's estate and whom I trusted completely. And then I waited, because I understood something that Daniel and Knox did not. I did not need to do anything to the system. The system was going to respond to the situation on its own. The root authentication layer I had built was not designed to lock people out. It was designed to verify identity during structural transitions. When the system encountered a transition event and could not locate the registered root authority, it did not crash, did not fail. Simply stopped accepting commands it could not verify. I had not locked them out. I had left. And the system had noticed. The first sign that something was wrong came 36 hours after my termination. Knox called me at 7:40 in the morning. I did not answer. He left a voicemail that described what he called a minor export issue with the automated compliance reporting sequence. His voice had the careful quality of someone trying to sound calm about something that was making them less than calm. I listened to the voicemail twice and did not return the call. By that afternoon, based on information that reached me later through a former colleague named Beth Paulson who still worked in the operations department, the situation had expanded considerably. The automated compliance export sequence had frozen completely. Vendor API calls that ran on a 12-hour cycle were timing out before completing. Permission elevation requests submitted by department managers were returning error codes that nobody on the current IT team could identify. Each of these failures had a different surface appearance, different error messages, different affected systems, different departments reporting problems. But they all had the same root cause. The structural transition that had occurred when my employment ended had triggered verification requests from the root authentication layer. The system was looking for confirmation from the registered root authority before proceeding with operations that fell under its oversight. It was not finding that confirmation, because the registered root authority no longer worked there. Knox attempted 3 separate override commands on the second day. Each one failed. And the third failure triggered something that Knox had no way of knowing was coming. Daniel called me on the morning of the third day. My phone showed his name on the screen. I sat and watched it ring through to voicemail. Then I made myself a cup of coffee and waited for the voicemail notification. When I listened to it, he did not begin with a greeting. He simply started speaking. "Olivia, we are experiencing a significant system issue and we need you to explain what you did before you left. Call me back immediately." His voice had lost the polished ease it carried in the termination meeting. It had a tight, clipped quality now. The quality of a man who had presented himself as being in complete control of a situation, and was privately beginning to understand that he was not. I called Carol Simmons instead. I told her about the voicemail. I told her about the system failures Beth had described. I told her about the root authentication layer and the vendor registry. Carol was quiet for a moment. "Do not contact Daniel directly," she said. "Do not contact anyone at Harrow except through me. And send me every piece of documentation you have related to the redundancy proposals you submitted." I had already organized that documentation the night before. I sent it to Carol within the hour. Then I sent a single reply to Daniel's voicemail by text message. It said, "I am no longer employed at Harrow Logistics. For any matters related to my former employment, please contact my attorney, Carol Simmons." I included Carol's office number. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen table and helped my son with his homework. By the end of the third day, the situation at Harrow had reached the board of directors. Beth called me that evening, speaking quietly like someone making a call they were not entirely sure they should be making. "The board called an emergency session this afternoon," she said. "Payroll processing is delayed. The shipping coordination platform is throwing errors on every outbound confirmation. And the regulatory reporting queue has been frozen since yesterday morning." I listened without commenting. "Daniel told them it was a technical transition issue," Beth continued. "He said the new IT team was resolving it. But one of the board members, a man named Arthur Fields who has been on the board for 11 years, asked specifically about the structural dependency audit. And Daniel did not know what that meant. Thanked Beth for calling. I told her to be careful about the information she shared and to protect herself first. After I ended the call, I sat for a long time thinking about Arthur Fields and his question. An experienced board member asking about a structural dependency audit on day 3 of a systems crisis was not a coincidence. Someone on that board either had a technical background or had spoken to someone who did. Either way, the conversation had shifted from being about a technical glitch to being about how the glitch had happened and who was responsible for the conditions that created it. That was a very different conversation. And it was the conversation I had been waiting for. I had documentation going back 4 years. Not because I had been planning for this specific situation. I kept records because I had worked in infrastructure long enough to understand that the difference between a problem getting solved and a problem getting blamed on the wrong person is almost always a matter of who has the clearest written record of what actually happened. In my files I had archived copies of every email I had sent recommending multi-administrator redundancy for the root registry. There were 3 of them, spanning a period of 22 months. Each one laid out the risk clearly, described the technical steps required to add a second administrator, and estimated the time investment at less than 2 weeks of coordinated effort. I had the acknowledgement receipts showing each email had been opened and read. I had the risk assessment memo I had submitted to the previous director of operations 18 months ago, which described in plain terms what would happen to the system during a structural transition if the root registry contained only one authorized identity. I had the transition protocol document I had prepared 2 years earlier outlining the proper handoff procedure for root administrator credentials. That document had been signed by 2 members of the former leadership team. It had then sat in a shared drive folder that Daniel had apparently never opened. I had printed copies of all of it. I had digital copies on my personal encrypted drive. I had sent a complete set to Carol the morning after Daniel's voicemail. When the board asked what had happened and why nobody had seen it coming, the answer was going to be sitting in a clearly organized file with dates and signatures on every page. On the 4th day, Knox made the mistake that changed everything from a technical problem into a legal one. Beth called me again that afternoon. Her voice tighter than the night before. Knox had attempted to access the root registry directly by forcing an override through the vendor portal. He used a set of administrative credentials that had been provisioned for his new director role. The credentials gave him broad operational access across most of the system. They did not give him root-level structural authority. The vendor portal recognized the discrepancy immediately. An unauthorized override attempt at the root registry level triggered an automatic compliance lock. This was not something I had set up specifically for this situation. It was a standard regulatory defense protocol that the vendor had built into the system architecture years before I had even joined Harrow. The compliance lock flagged the event to an external regulatory monitoring body automatically. External auditors were notified within the hour. Knox had not known the lock existed. Daniel had not known the lock existed. Nobody had thought to ask the person who built the system whether there were any automated regulatory triggers they should be aware of before attempting a forced override. I found out about it from Carol, who had already received a preliminary inquiry from the auditing body by 5 o'clock that afternoon. This just became significantly more serious, Carol told me. I know, I said. Are you prepared for what comes next? I have been prepared for a while, I said. The board contacted me directly on the morning of the 5th day. Not through Daniel. Not through Knox. Not through the HR department that had processed my termination paperwork. Arthur Fields called Carol's office and requested a meeting with me at my earliest convenience. He was courteous. He was measured. He used the word respectful twice in a 5-minute phone call, which told me that someone had briefed him thoroughly on the situation, and he understood that the dynamic between Harrow and me had shifted considerably since Tuesday morning. The meeting was scheduled for the following day at a neutral location, a private conference suite at a hotel 2 miles from the Harrow offices. Arthur Fields was 63 years old and had spent the first half of his career in technology operations before moving into executive leadership and eventually board governance. When I sat across from him the next morning, I understood within the first few minutes that he was not there to manage the situation on Daniel's behalf. He was there because the board needed to understand what had actually happened, and Daniel had proven himself incapable of explaining it accurately. Arthur asked me to walk him through the root authentication layer from the beginning. I did, clearly, without technical jargon where plain language would serve better. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the redundancy proposals you submitted. Do you have copies?" I opened my folder and placed them on the table between us. He read each one in full. Arthur Fields called Carol the following morning with a formal offer of reinstatement. The offer included restoration of my previous position, a salary increase of 18%, a written formal apology from the board, and a title upgrade to Senior Systems Director with expanded departmental authority. Carol presented it to me over the phone that afternoon. I listened to every detail without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I appreciated the offer, but that I was not ready to accept or decline it without one additional condition being met first. I asked for an independent audit. Not of my performance. Not of the technical system failures. A full independent audit of the decision-making process that had led to my termination, the hiring practices surrounding Knox Albright's appointment, the policy bypasses that had occurred during Daniel's tenure, and the complete history of how the redundancy proposals had been received and handled. Carol was quiet for a brief moment. "That is a significant request," she said. "I know," I said. "It is also the only way to know whether anything has actually changed." Carol relayed the condition to Arthur Fields. He called back within 2 hours and agreed without negotiation. The fact that he agreed that quickly told me the board had already been considering exactly that kind of review and had been waiting to see whether I would ask for it. The audit was scheduled to begin the following Monday. The external investigators arrived on Monday morning and spent the next 3 weeks working through Harrow's records with the kind of thoroughness that organizations only invite when they are genuinely trying to understand something rather than manage how it appears. They reviewed hiring decisions going back 18 months. They examined every policy bypass that had occurred during Daniel's 6-month tenure. They analyzed the internal restructuring decisions he had made, including the changes to meeting distribution lists, reporting hierarchies, and approval workflows. They reviewed Daniel's override attempts on the system during the crisis period. They examined the documentation trail around Knox's appointment and the timeline of his shadowing sessions with me. And they found what careful documentation always reveals when someone has been doing things they should not have been doing. Daniel had represented my termination to the board as a performance-based decision. He had described my work as misaligned with the company's modernization goals and my attitude toward new leadership as obstructive. The auditors pulled my performance metrics for the previous 3 years. My ratings were the highest of anyone in the systems department. My project completion rate was 94%. My infrastructure uptime record was the strongest in the company's history. My cost efficiency numbers had saved Harrow an estimated $2.3 million over the course of my tenure. Daniel's stated justification for my termination did not survive contact with the actual record. And because the termination had been executed based on a false representation to the board, the HR department that had processed it without independent verification was now also implicated in the findings. The auditors presented their preliminary findings to the full board on a Thursday afternoon. Carol attended on my behalf. She called me afterward and described the meeting in detail. Daniel had been given the opportunity to respond to the findings before the board session. His response had focused on what he called legacy architecture challenges and technical oversight during a complex leadership transition. He argued that the root registry situation represented an inherited vulnerability rather than a failure of his own judgment. The auditors then presented my redundancy proposal from 22 months earlier, dated, formally submitted through the correct internal channel. Then the proposal from 14 months earlier. Then the proposal from 7 months earlier, submitted 3 months before Daniel arrived. Each one describing exactly the vulnerability that had just cost the company 6 days of operational disruption and triggered an external regulatory inquiry. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Arthur Fields asked Daniel a single question. He asked whether Daniel had reviewed the infrastructure risk documentation before initiating the leadership transition. Daniel said he had relied on Knox to conduct that review. Arthur turned to Knox, who was also present. Knox said he had assumed Daniel had already reviewed it. The auditors noted in their report that the registered root authority had not been consulted at any point during the transition planning process. Carol told me the boardroom was very quiet after that particular finding was read aloud. Knox Albright gave a formal statement to the auditors the following morning. He admitted that he had never accessed the structural registry before accepting the systems director position. He had not known the registry existed in its current form. During our training sessions together, he said, I had covered operational procedures thoroughly but had not walked him through the root layer. The auditors noted in their report that the root layer orientation would typically have been part of a formal transition handoff process, and that no such process had been initiated or requested before my termination. Knox also acknowledged that he had not reviewed any of my submitted proposals before attempting the override on the fourth day. He said Daniel had told him the export failures were a routine migration issue that a standard override would resolve. When the auditors asked Knox whether he had consulted any technical documentation before attempting the override, he said he had not. When they asked whether he had been advised that unauthorized override attempts at the root registry level could trigger external compliance protocols, he said he had not been aware of that possibility. The auditor's report described the sequence of events that led to the compliance lock in careful, neutral language. But the conclusion it pointed toward was not neutral at all. Two people had made a series of significant decisions about a system they did not understand, without consulting the person who had built it, and without reviewing the documentation she had provided. The collapse that followed was not the result of legacy architecture. It was the result of unchecked certainty operating in the absence of knowledge. The internal memo went out on a Friday afternoon. It used the phrase leadership transition under review, which is the kind of language organizations use when they need to communicate that something has gone wrong without formally assigning responsibility before the process has concluded. Beth forwarded it to me within minutes of it hitting inboxes. I read it once. Then I set my phone down and thought about what it meant. 3 weeks earlier I had walked out of a room full of people applauding my replacement. I had driven home and made dinner and called my attorney and told myself to stay steady. I had spent the days that followed being methodical, being documented, being patient in the way that people have to be patient when the situation requires endurance rather than speed. The memo was not justice. It was a signal. It was the organization beginning the process of acknowledging publicly that something had gone wrong. Daniel had resigned 2 days before the memo circulated. His departure was announced in a separate communication that described him as pursuing other opportunities. That phrase, in my experience, almost always means the same thing. It means the choice between resigning and being removed had been presented clearly enough that resignation became the obvious selection. Knox had been returned to his previous role pending a review of his appointment process. He had not been terminated. He had made serious errors in judgment, but the audit had established clearly that he had operated largely on the instructions and assurances of a person above him who had misrepresented the situation. The person above him was gone. The audit was nearly complete. And the board had asked Carol to arrange another meeting. The second meeting with Arthur Fields was different from the first. The first meeting had been about understanding. Arthur had needed to learn what had happened technically and why, and I had explained it as clearly and as completely as I could. This meeting was about what came next. Arthur arrived with 2 other board members. One of them was a woman named Helen Marsh who had joined the board 8 months earlier, and whom I had never met. She had a background in operations governance and asked precise questions that told me she had read the audit report in full before coming into the room. Arthur opened the conversation directly. "The board owes you an apology," he said. "Not a qualified one. Direct one. What happened to you was wrong. The decision was made on false grounds, it was executed in a manner that was deliberately humiliating, and it caused you real harm. We are sorry." I had not expected those words in that sequence. I held them for a moment before responding. "I appreciate that," I said. And I meant it. Helen Marsh leaned forward. "We would like to discuss what a genuine path forward looks like," she said. "Not a reinstatement offer framed as a favor. A real conversation about what you would need to return to Harrow in a role that reflects your actual contribution to this organization." I told them I was listening. Arthur placed a folder on the table. I opened it and read carefully. The formal offer was unlike anything I had expected. The title was Chief Systems Architect. It was a newly created position that sat above the systems director role and reported directly to the board rather than through the operations chain. It came with full departmental authority, including the ability to hire, restructure, and establish technical policy without requiring operational approval for decisions that fell within my area of expertise. The compensation package included a salary that represented a 31% increase over what I had been earning before my termination, plus equity options that vested over a 4-year period. The written acknowledgement of wrongful termination was formal, specific, and drafted by outside legal counsel rather than internal HR. Did not use softened language. It stated plainly that my termination had been based on false representations to the board, and that the decision had not reflected my performance, which the audit had confirmed was exemplary throughout my tenure. Carol had reviewed the document before the meeting and told me it was the most direct wrongful termination acknowledgement she had seen from a company of Harrow's size in 15 years of practice. I read every page of the offer slowly. 13 years of building something from nothing. 13 years of proposals submitted and filed and left unanswered. 13 years of expertise that had been called legacy, called resistant, called misaligned with modern leadership culture. Recognized. In writing. With a dollar amount attached and equity options vesting over time. I sat with the folder closed on the table in front of me for a long moment. Then I told Arthur and Helen that I needed a few days. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about it during my morning runs. I thought about it while making dinner. I sat with it quietly after my son went to bed, in the particular silence that Warren's absence had left in our house, a silence I had learned to sit inside rather than fill. The offer was real. The acknowledgement was genuine. Arthur Fields had struck me as an honest man who understood what had happened and was not trying to minimize it. But I kept returning to one specific memory. The moment the applause started. Not Daniel's smile. Not Knox looking away from me. The applause. 30 people who had worked alongside me, who had relied on the systems I built, who had submitted tickets to my team and attended my presentations and eaten lunch in the same cafeteria for years. 30 people who heard that I was being replaced by the man I had trained, and responded by clapping. Not all of them had believed the decision was right. I understood that. Some of them had clapped out of reflex. Some out of uncertainty. Some because not clapping felt like a risk they were not willing to take in that moment. But the culture that made that applause possible had not been created by Daniel alone. Daniel had been at Harrow for 6 months. That applause had roots that went deeper than 6 months. If they had done it once, with the right conditions in place, the conditions could return. I called Carol on the 3rd evening. I have made my decision, I told her. I declined the offer. Not out of bitterness. Not out of a desire to punish anyone or to make a point that needed to be made loudly. I declined because of clarity. When I sat honestly with the question of whether I wanted to return to Harrow, the answer I kept arriving at was not yes or no. It was a question of my own. The question was, what do I actually want my work to look like from here? And the answer to that question did not point back toward Harrow. It pointed somewhere I had been thinking about for longer than I had admitted to myself. I had spent 13 years building someone else's infrastructure. I had spent 13 years submitting proposals that were filed and forgotten. I had spent 13 years being the person who kept the system running while other people took credit for the system running. I knew how to build things that lasted. I knew how to identify risks before they became crises. I knew how to document, design, and implement infrastructure that protected organizations from exactly the kind of collapse Harrow had just experienced. Those were not skills that belonged to Harrow. They were mine. I had carried them in before I arrived, and I had carried them out when I left. Carol drafted my formal decline letter on a Monday. It was courteous and clear and expressed genuine appreciation for the board's acknowledgement and the sincerity of their offer. Then she helped me file the paperwork for a business license. 6 months after Daniel Whitaker fired me in front of 30 people who applauded, I opened Turner Infrastructure Consulting. The firm specialized in 2 things. Infrastructure risk management for mid-sized companies transitioning from external hosting to internal database systems. And leadership accountability auditing, which helped boards and executive teams understand the operational risks created when technical expertise is dismissed, replaced, or sidelined in favor of speed and political convenience. My first 3 clients came to me through referrals from the external auditing firm that had conducted the HARO review. All 3 were organizations dealing with the aftermath of executive decisions that had not accounted for the infrastructure realities beneath them. One client was managing a payroll system failure caused by a forced migration that had skipped the validation layer. One was recovering from a compliance breach triggered by a vendor registry dispute nearly identical to HARO's situation. The third had just lost their senior database architect to a wrongful termination and needed help understanding what they had actually lost. I helped all 3 of them. I also helped them build redundancy into their root systems, document their authorization chains properly, and establish multi-administrator protocols that meant no single departure could freeze their operations. The HARO system still ran on the architecture I had built. The board had implemented the redundancy measures I had proposed 3 times over the previous 4 years. A second root administrator had been registered. Policies had been rewritten. They had needed a crisis to do what a memo could have accomplished years earlier. That is more common than most organizations want to admit. I kept a copy of my original redundancy proposal in a frame on the wall of my office, not because I was proud of being right, but because it reminded me daily of something it had taken 13 years and one very public humiliation to fully understand. The systems that protect organizations are only as strong as the people willing to fight for them. And for the first time in a very long time I was building something that was entirely, completely, and permanently mine.